The precinct felt like a pressure cooker, the tension thick enough to choke on. Captain Marcus Hill stepped through the glass doors, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum floor, every sound amplified by the silence that followed him. Conversations halted mid-sentence as officers turned to stare. Some nodded politely. Others exchanged uneasy glances. A few, like Officer Derek Fields, barely hid their disdain, lips curling in faint sneers. Marcus was used to it. He had seen that look before, resentment wrapped in a thin veil of professionalism. But he had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let prejudice, whether blatant or whispered in the locker room, derail him. He paused at the edge of the bullpen, his presence commanding, without a single word. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady, calm, and deliberate. A few mumbled greetings echoed back. The room didn't erupt into applause, but Marcus wasn't expecting it. Change rarely came with cheers. The briefing room smelled faintly of stale coffee and yesterday's frustration. Marcus scanned the room as officers filed in, their postures ranging from guarded to openly dismissive. He noticed everything, the way some avoided eye contact, the forced grins of others pretending they weren't uncomfortable. Sergeant Ramirez, one of the few who seemed genuinely supportive, handed Marcus a stack of case files. "Welcome aboard, Captain," she said, her tone warm but her eyes wary. "Even allies here tread lightly." "Thank you, Sergeant," Marcus replied, meeting her gaze. He could sense her hope, but also her caution. She wanted change, but she had seen enough leaders come and go to know that words meant little without action. As Marcus took his place at the front of the room, the quiet murmurs died down. He let the silence linger, commanding the space without raising his voice. "I won't take much of your time," he began, his tone calm but unyielding. "I know change isn't easy. And I know my appointment as captain has stirred mixed emotions in this department." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Derek Fields leaned back, arms crossed, his smirk a silent challenge. "But let me be clear," Marcus continued, locking eyes with Derek briefly before sweeping his gaze across the room. "I'm not here to dismantle what works. I'm here to fix what doesn't. Justice starts with us. Accountability starts with us. If we're asking the community to trust us, we must earn it, every single day." The room was silent, the air electric. Marcus's words hung there, daring anyone to challenge them. He closed the meeting with a firm, "Let's get to work," and stepped back, giving them space to absorb his message. As he walked out, he could feel the eyes on him, some watching with hope, others with skepticism, and a few with open hostility. Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Change wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And he was ready to run. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet, suburban street. Marcus Hill adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, the muted rhythm of his footsteps blending with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a dog. He wasn't here on duty, just a man enjoying a walk, a rare moment of peace before the storm of leadership demands. This neighborhood was unfamiliar but welcoming, with its neatly trimmed hedges and children playing hopscotch on the sidewalks. Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come from the gritty streets of his childhood, where opportunities seemed as scarce as streetlights. Further down the block, Derek Fields was behind the wheel of his patrol car, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. The radio chatter filled the silence, but he wasn't really listening. His mood had soured after another tense meeting with his sergeant about diversity initiatives and the need for cultural sensitivity. To Derek, it felt like the department was bending over backward to cater to public outcry. He muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the wheel as he turned onto a quiet residential street. Then he saw him, a tall black man walking alone, wearing a dark hoodie and baseball cap. To Derek, it didn't matter that Marcus was simply enjoying the evening air. He was out of place. Suspicious. "Great," Derek mumbled, flipping on his lights. "Another one of these guys, strolling where he doesn't belong." Marcus glanced over his shoulder as the patrol car slowed to a crawl beside him. The flash of red and blue lights painted the street in flickering shades of tension. His gut tightened, but his expression remained calm. He'd faced moments like this before, but this one stung differently. Here he was, a man who had spent his career fighting to protect justice, now being sized up as a threat. The car screeched to a stop. Derek stepped out, hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Hey you! Stop right there," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus stopped, turning slowly. He raised his hand slightly, palms out, a gesture not of surrender, but of caution. "Is there a problem, officer?" His tone was even, but there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. "You live around here?" Derek shot back, narrowing his eyes. "This isn't exactly a shortcut." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't realize I needed your permission to take a walk." Derek's jaw tightened. "ID now." Marcus didn't move. "I don't believe I'm required to show identification unless I'm being detained." "Am I being detained, officer?" The question hit like a sharp gust of wind. Derek's face darkened with frustration. His training whispered caution, but his pride screamed louder. "Don't play smart with me, buddy. Let's make this simple." But the air between them was already thick, a silent standoff brewing in the fading light. Neither man knew this moment would ignite a spark that would change their lives, and the precinct, forever. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, but the tension crackling in the air was anything but comforting. Marcus walked leisurely along the sidewalk, his thoughts preoccupied with the challenges awaiting him at the precinct. He noticed the patrol car creeping along the curb out of the corner of his eye, but paid it no mind, until the sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, you there?" Marcus stopped, turning to see Officer Derek Fields stepping out of the car, his posture rigid, hand resting on his belt. The air felt heavy, as though the world had paused to watch what would happen next. "Yes, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice measured. Derek's gaze was sharp, scanning Marcus from head to toe. "What are you doing here? This neighborhood doesn't see much of your kind." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I wasn't aware walking was a crime," he replied evenly. "It's not, unless you've got something to hide. Let's see some ID." Derek's tone was accusatory, his chest puffed out as if daring Marcus to refuse. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I don't need to show you anything. I'm not breaking the law." That simple statement was like gasoline to a flame. Derek's face darkened, his voice rising. "Don't get smart with me. Hands out of your pockets, now." Marcus sighed, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Officer, I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing." But Derek wasn't listening. Frustration and unchecked bias boiled over, and before Marcus could react, Derek's fist connected with his jaw. Marcus staggered back, tasting blood but refusing to falter. The sound of another car screeching to a halt broke the moment. A second officer rushed out, eyes wide with recognition. "Captain Hill, are you all right?" Derek froze, his face draining of color as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him. The world resumed its movement, but for Derek, it was as though time had just stopped. Marcus sat up slowly, wiping blood from a split lip as the patrol car's headlights lit the street. Derek Fields loomed over him, breathing hard, his fists still clenched. "You people think you can do whatever you want," Derek spat, yanking his radio to call for backup. His words stung, but Marcus remained calm, his silence more powerful than any retort. The screech of tires broke the tension as another squad car pulled up. Officer Ruiz stepped out, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Her face froze when the beam landed on Marcus. "Captain Hill," she stammered, lowering her light. Are you okay, sir?" Derek's brows furrowed. "What did you just say?" "That's Captain Marcus Hill," Ruiz said, her voice laced with disbelief. She turned to Derek, her face pale. "The new precinct captain." Derek's entire demeanor shifted as realization hit him like a freight train. His jaw slackened, his chest heaving not from exertion but from sheer panic. His gaze darted from Ruiz to Marcus, then to his own hands, as if they alone could undo what had just transpired. Marcus stood slowly, towering over Derek despite the pain radiating through his ribs. His eyes locked on Derek's, unblinking and sharp, cutting through the weight of the moment. "Officer Fields," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel, "return to the precinct immediately." "Captain, Derek stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure of his own disbelief. "Immediately," Marcus repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ruiz stepped in, quietly urging Derek back toward his patrol car. Derek staggered away, his confidence shattered, his world unraveling. As the cars drove off, Marcus stood alone in the quiet street. He exhaled slowly, straightened his jacket, and whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." The precinct was a hive of tension, whispers crawling through its halls like wildfire. Derek Fields sat at his desk, the weight of his actions pressing against his chest like a vice. He hadn't slept. The moment played on a loop in his mind, his fist connecting, the stunned look on Marcus Hill's face, and the devastating words, "Captain Hill." In the break room, officers exchanged murmurs. "Did you hear?" "Fields punched the new captain," someone said in a low voice. "No way." "He didn't know," another replied, their disbelief tinged with unease. A silence followed, heavy with judgment. The department was no stranger to controversy, but this was different. This wasn't just a public relations nightmare, it was a mirror reflecting the biases they all tried to ignore. Marcus Hill arrived that morning with the quiet authority of a storm brewing on the horizon. His face betrayed no emotion, but his presence silenced conversations mid-sentence. He walked past Derek without a word, his steps deliberate. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment, and somehow that cut deeper. In the captain's office, Marcus convened his leadership team. The atmosphere was tense, a clash of unspoken opinions and professional restraint. "This isn't just about one officer," Marcus began, his voice measured but firm. "This is about us. About what we stand for. If we allow this behavior to go unchecked, we're saying it's acceptable." Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus didn't flinch. "Accountability starts here. I will not lead a department that turns a blind eye to prejudice." As the meeting ended, Marcus stood by the window, watching the city he'd sworn to protect. He knew the road ahead would be long and unforgiving. But change, he reminded himself, was never easy. And this was only the beginning. Derek sat in his darkened living room, the glow of the TV flickering across his face. The news anchors were already dissecting the incident, using words like racial bias and abuse of power. His jaw tightened. He turned the volume down, but the words lingered in the air, pressing on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, another text from a colleague. "What were you thinking?" He didn't respond. What was there to say? He replayed the moment in his mind, the fury in his voice, the crack of his fist meeting Marcus's jaw. And then, those words. "Captain Hill." "Jesus," Derek muttered, rubbing his hands over his face. He hadn't slept in 2 nights, and the walls seemed to be closing in. Part of him wanted to lash out, to blame the system for putting him in this position, for making it harder to just do his job. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't seen a suspect that day. He'd seen a stereotype. And now, the shame of it burned in his chest. A knock at the door startled him. Derek hesitated before opening it to reveal Officer Daniels, his partner. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "You messed up," she said bluntly, dropping into a chair. "You think I don't know that?" Derek shot back, his voice defensive. "No, I don't think you do. This wasn't just a mistake, Derek. This was you letting your biases control you. And now the whole precinct's paying for it." He wanted to argue, to deflect, but her words hit like a punch to the gut. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked quietly, the fight draining from his voice. Daniels leaned forward. "Own it. Learn from it. Or get out. Because this department doesn't have room for what you did." Derek slumped back in his chair, her words echoing in the silence. For the first time, he began to wonder if he could change, or if it was already too late. Marcus sat alone in his dimly lit office, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The precinct buzzed outside his door, but inside, the room was still, save for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. On his desk lay 2 files, one detailing Officer Derek Field's history, commendations and complaints side by side, and another outlining the disciplinary procedures he had the authority to enforce. The punch still echoed in his memory. Not the pain, but the audacity. Derek hadn't seen Marcus as a man, let alone his superior. He'd seen a threat, a suspect, an image painted by his own prejudice. Justice must be fair, Marcus whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the clock. But fairness wasn't always simple. He had the power to end Derek's career, to make an example of him. Yet, what would that solve? Would firing one officer undo the biases rooted so deeply in the precinct? Or would it deepen the divide? A knock interrupted his thoughts. His deputy, Lieutenant Ramirez, stepped in. "Captain," she said softly, sensing the storm in his mind. "Do you think people can truly change, Ramirez?" he asked, looking up. She paused, then nodded. "If they're forced to confront their flaws, yes. But it's up to them to choose growth." Her words struck a chord. Marcus thought of his own journey, how he'd faced racism early in his career, the quiet resolve it took to rise above it without letting it harden his heart. He realized Derek's punishment couldn't just be about retribution. It had to challenge him to reflect and grow. Closing the files, Marcus leaned back, a plan beginning to form. "Then let's make sure he confronts them," he said, his voice steady now. The fight wasn't over, but Marcus knew the battle for real change was just beginning. The conference room was tense, heavy with anticipation. Officers filled the seats, their eyes shifting between the long table and the door, where Marcus Hill stood. His presence was calm, but the weight of his responsibility was palpable. He was about to speak on behalf of more than just himself. It was the integrity of the entire department on the line. Derek Field sat at the opposite end of the table, his face pale and tight with discomfort. He had spent the past days reflecting on the punch he'd thrown, how quickly his assumptions had clouded his judgment, how his knee-jerk reaction to Marcus's presence had turned violent. The shame of what he had done gnawed at him now, more than any reprimand. Marcus stood for a moment, silent, letting the tension build. He could feel the eyes on him, some full of pity, others of defiance. But his gaze was fixed on Derek. There was no anger in him, just a quiet resolve. His voice cut through the silence, steady and unyielding. "Bias is something we all carry," he began, the room falling still. "It's something we inherit, something we learn, and, if we're not careful, something that can dictate our actions without us even realizing it. But our job is to fight against that. Not just against criminals, but against our own impulses." Derek flinched. The words hit him harder than any punch. "Today, we are not just here to discuss a mistake. We're here to talk about the kind of officers we want to be. Do we want to be people who let our biases rule us? Or do we want to be the kind of men and women who stand up to them, no matter how hard it is?" The room was silent, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "Derek Fields," Marcus continued, locking eyes with him, "I'm giving you a chance. Not just to make amends, but to prove that we can all change. This department will not tolerate unchecked prejudice, but it will give you the tools to be better." Derek swallowed, his throat dry. There was no easy way out of this, but for the first time, he understood that change wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. The decision was made. The healing had begun. The room was quiet as Derek sat at the table, his face pale, his hands trembling. Marcus stood before him, the weight of the moment pressing on both of them. The disciplinary hearing had gone as expected. Derek had admitted his mistake, but the shame hung heavy in the air. Marcus could see the inner conflict in Derek's eyes. The hardened officer, who had once walked with arrogance, was now struggling with the reality of his actions. The punch, the racial assumption, it was all out in the open now. "You've made a mistake, Derek," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "A big one. But how you handle this now will define who you are as an officer, and as a person." Derek shifted in his chair, his eyes cast down. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Captain. I was angry. I didn't think." "Anger is no excuse for violence," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. "But what matters now is what you do next. You can either keep defending your biases, or face them head-on. There was a long pause, the room holding its breath. Derek's gaze finally met Marcus's, and for the first time, it wasn't filled with defiance. It was filled with something else, regret, maybe even a trace of fear. I'm willing to learn, Derek muttered, his voice almost lost in the silence. Marcus's expression softened, but his words were resolute. You'll attend bias training. You'll work with the community. And if you ever pull a stunt like this again, you'll be out. Derek nodded, the weight of the ultimatum clear. He didn't argue, didn't try to justify himself. As he left the room, Marcus stood there for a moment longer, staring out the window. He had done the right thing, but the road ahead was still long. Change, Marcus knew, wasn't a single moment, it was a series of decisions, small and large, made over time. And for the first time in a while, he felt a glimmer of hope that Derek might just be ready to walk that road. Marcus stood by the window of his office, looking out over the city as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the horizon with fiery hues. Subscribe to our channel for soul-stirring stories.